It's June 1944. Imagine you're in a plane over the English Channel. The engine hums, the air is thick with tension. Around you, men from Easy Company sit silently, some gripping rosaries, some just staring at their boots. In a few minutes, they'll be falling through the dark sky into Normandy. Some won't see the morning, but tonight, all they can do is wait. Hi, my name is Sam, and welcome to Eyes Shut History, before we parachute into this deadly tale. If you like these stories and feel like you learned something from these videos, then please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps me out to make more stories for you guys. Now, sit back, relax, and let your eyes shut to history. The story of Easy Company did not begin in the skies over France. It began in the red clay and sweltering heat of Georgia at a place called Camp Tocoa. It was 1942. The war was already raging, and America needed a new kind of soldier. Not just infantry, but men who could be dropped behind enemy lines, self-reliant, fast, and able to fight with whatever they had until help arrived. The very idea of paratroopers seemed reckless to some and suicidal to others. To the young men who signed up, it sounded like adventure, glory, and perhaps a quicker path home. Tocoa was no paradise. The camp was rough, the barracks basic, and the food not much better than something you'd scrape from the bottom of a soup pot after a week. The men sweated through uniforms that never seemed to dry, and discovered quickly that the main feature of the landscape was a looming hill called Currahee. 3 miles up, 3 miles down. That was the mantra. If you couldn't run Currahee, you couldn't be a paratrooper. Some men joked that the mountain wasn't just a hill, but a living thing, personally out to break them. The runs were brutal. In the sticky Georgia summer, shirts clung to skin and dust-coated tongues until every breath felt like chewing sand. Boots wore through, blisters bled, but still they ran. The officers shouted, men cursed, but slowly, painfully, the legs grew stronger. Currahee became not just a test of endurance, but a badge of honor. Those who conquered it carried a bond that words couldn't quite explain. Training at Tocoa wasn't only about running, of course. The instructors, particularly Captain Herbert Sobel, made sure of that. Sobel was a figure out of a soldier's nightmare. He demanded perfection in drills, punished the smallest mistakes, and seemed to take joy in making life miserable. His men cursed his name more often than they saluted it. Yet, in his own harsh way, Sobel forged discipline. Under his command, Easy Company learned to move like one body, to fire with precision, to set up ambushes in minutes. They hated him, but some later admitted that without him, they might never have survived the war's first weeks. Still, resentment brewed. Sobel was brilliant in the classroom and on paper, but when it came to field exercises, he blundered. He got his men lost, gave conflicting orders, and seemed unable to read a map without turning it upside down. The men grumbled quietly at first, then openly. Paratroopers were meant to fight as a team, but under Sobel, the team felt fractured. Eventually, their complaints reached higher ears, and Sobel was reassigned before combat. The men cheered, though some, years later, would grudgingly thank him for the suffering he put them through. Beyond Sobel, there were moments of levity. Training wasn't all misery. Soldiers played pranks, snuck into town when they could, and swapped stories from back home. A boy from Pennsylvania might find himself laughing with a farmhand from Texas or a mechanic from New Jersey. For many, this was their first time out of their home state, and suddenly they were surrounded by men from across America. The accents blended, the slang mixed, and slowly Easy Company became not just a unit, but a family. One of the most nerve-wracking parts of training was the parachute tower. It loomed over the camp like a carnival ride, designed by a sadist. Men were strapped in, hoisted up, and then dropped, suddenly, swaying and jerking, until they hit the ground with a thump that rattled bones. Some loved it, others loathed it. Everyone, though, knew that the real jumps from real planes would be far worse. When the day came for their first flight, hearts hammered in chests, the C-47 roared down the runway, lifted into the air, and suddenly the ground was a patchwork quilt far below. At the command, men hurled themselves into the wind, chutes cracking open like thunder overhead. Terror turned to exhilaration. They were paratroopers now. By the time Easy Company finished their training, they were no longer raw recruits. They were leaner, tougher, and welded together by sweat and hardship. They had run Currahee until it haunted their dreams, drilled until movements became second nature, and jumped until fear was something to be carried, not avoided. They were ready, or as ready as anyone could be, for what waited across the Atlantic. England was the next stop. Compared to Georgia, it felt almost like a foreign planet. The air was damp and cool, the countryside green and rolling. Villages looked like they'd been lifted from storybooks, with thatched roofs and stone cottages. The local pubs became a second home for many soldiers, where beer was warm, the food unfamiliar, and the welcome sometimes frosty. American manners, loud voices, quick smiles, too much chewing gum, didn't always sit well with British locals. Still, friendships were forged, romances sparked, and for a few fleeting months, the war felt far away. But it was never far. Training intensified. Night exercises mimicked the conditions of the invasion to come. Men practiced jumps until it felt routine, learned to navigate with only moonlight, and rehearsed assaults on mock villages. Equipment piled up, rifles, grenades, knives, packs, and parachutes heavy enough to drag a man down like an anchor. Some joked they carried enough gear to sink if they landed in a puddle. As June 1944 approached, the air grew heavy with tension. Rumors swirled, but everyone knew the invasion was coming. The question wasn't if, but when. Easy Company waited, restless and coiled like a spring. Letters home were written and rewritten. Some men confessed their fears. Others kept it light, but all knew that the next time they wrote might be their last. On the evening of June 5th, they boarded the planes. The roar of engines filled the airfields, a sound that would stay with them forever. Each man carried not just weapons and gear, but the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. They were about to step into the largest invasion the world had ever seen. And so the engines hummed. The air was thick with tension, and around them, men from Easy Company sat silently, some gripping rosaries, some just staring at their boots. In a few minutes, they would be falling through the dark sky into Normandy. Some wouldn't see the morning. But tonight, all they could do was wait. The green light above the door flicked on, and the silence inside the plane shattered. "Go, go, go!" the jumpmaster bellowed, and Easy Company surged forward. Men were suddenly weightless, bodies hurtling into the night, parachutes snapping open with bone-jarring force. The air was thick with tracer fire, red and green lines slicing through the darkness like demented fireworks. The sky was alive with chaos. Below, Normandy stretched out in jagged patterns of fields and hedgerows, patched together like a crooked quilt. Flooded marshes reflected the moonlight, turning safe-looking fields into death traps. A few poor souls splashed down into them, weighed down by gear, and never came back up. Others crashed through trees, their shoots tangled, dangling helplessly above the ground like ornaments no one wanted. If you were lucky, you landed in a field. If you were less lucky, you landed in one already occupied by Germans. The drop scattered Easy Company all over the countryside. What was meant to be an organized landing zone became a scramble of lost men trying to find each other in the dark. One soldier recalled walking alone for hours. Every shadow a threat, the silence broken only by the occasional crack of distant gunfire. Another stumbled into a group of paratroopers from a completely different regiment and decided, sensibly, to stick with them until daylight. But even in the chaos, small groups formed. Soldiers gathered whoever they could find, regardless of unit, and pressed forward. The objective was simple: disrupt the Germans, seize key causeways, and make sure reinforcements couldn't reach the beaches where thousands of men would soon be storming ashore. Whether they were 12 men or 3 didn't matter. Every step forward was part of the invasion. Easy Company fought its way towards Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, clearing enemy positions and seizing crossroads. The first hours were a blur of gunfire, shouts, and confusion. At one moment, men were creeping through fields, trying to stay quiet. The next, they were charging across open ground under machine gun fire, the whistle of bullets far too close. Some men swore later they couldn't even remember pulling the trigger, only the smell of gunpowder and the pounding of their own hearts. By dawn, the beaches were erupting with the full force of D-Day, and inland, Easy Company was doing its part. The fight for causeways turned into a series of sharp, brutal clashes. Germans fired from hedgerows that seemed to sprout rifles like weeds. Mortar rounds burst overhead, showering dirt and steel. Yet inch by inch, the Americans pushed forward. Then came Carentan, a small town, hardly worth notice on a map, but vital for linking the American forces from Utah and Omaha beaches. The Germans knew it, and they dug in hard. Easy Company was ordered to take it. The approach was through flat, exposed fields, the kind of terrain that turns soldiers into targets. Machine guns rattled from hidden nests, pinning men down. Mortar shells screamed overhead. The air filled with the sickening buzz of incoming rounds, and the ground seemed to explode at random. Soldiers crawled forward, mud clinging to their uniforms, ears ringing from near misses. One man later said he wasn't sure if he was advancing or simply trying to dig his way into the earth to escape. When Easy Company reached the town, the fighting turned even more intimate. Streets became battlegrounds, houses became fortresses. Soldiers kicked down doors, tossed grenades through windows, and exchanged fire across rooms that had once been living spaces. Civilians huddled in cellars, terrified, while the battle raged above. One paratrooper remembered clearing a house only to find a dining table still set for dinner, as if the family had simply vanished moments before the war came crashing through the walls. It was chaos, terrifying and relentless. Men fired from windowsills, ducked behind rubble, and shouted to one another over the thunder of artillery. Every corner held the possibility of an ambush, every shadow the silhouette of a rifle. Yet slowly, block by block, Easy Company drove the Germans out. By the time Carentan was secure, the streets were littered with shell casings, shattered glass, and the scars of battle. The cost was high. Men who had joked on the plain days earlier were gone. Some were buried in hastily dug graves, marked with helmets and rifles stuck into the earth. Others were carried back, wounded, their futures uncertain. Survivors pressed on because there was no alternative. The war didn't stop for grief. Still, even in the midst of loss, there were moments of strange humanity. Soldiers scavenged food from abandoned houses, frying eggs in their helmets or boiling coffee over makeshift fires. Someone always had a cigarette to share, a joke to crack, even if it was dark humor. One soldier, looking at a ruined farmhouse, quipped, "Well, at least the rent's cheap." Another replied, "Yeah, but the neighbors are a bit noisy." In war, laughter was as much a weapon as any rifle, a way to keep despair at bay. By the end of their Normandy campaign, Easy Company had accomplished what they'd been sent to do. They'd disrupted German defenses, secured critical ground, and given the men on the beaches a fighting chance. But they'd also learned, brutally, what combat really meant. It wasn't glory or clean victories or even survival. It was mud, blood, exhaustion. and the unshakable bond between the men who endured it together. For the soldiers of Easy Company, Normandy was the beginning. They had jumped into darkness, fought through chaos, and come out the other side scarred but unbroken. They didn't know then what lay ahead, the bridges of Holland, the forests of Bastogne, the march into Germany. All they knew was that they were still standing, still together, and still ready for whatever came next. By September 1944, Easy Company was on the move again. Normandy was behind them, though not forgotten, and the Allies were pressing across Europe. The war felt as if it might be turning in their favor. Paris had been liberated. German forces were retreating. Whispers went around that maybe, just maybe, the war could be over by Christmas. High Command, brimming with confidence, decided it was time for a bold move. A plan called Operation Market Garden. The name sounded harmless enough, like a trip to a farmer's market. In reality, it was one of the most ambitious and risky maneuvers of the war. The idea was to drop paratroopers deep into the Netherlands, seize a chain of bridges, and open a road straight into the heart of Germany. If it worked, the war might end within months. If it failed, well, nobody wanted to think about that. For Easy Company, Market Garden began with another parachute jump. This time, the skies over Holland were clear, the sun shining, the fields below green and open. Compared to Normandy's stormy night, it felt almost peaceful. As the men leapt from their planes, their parachutes blossomed like white flowers against the blue sky. On the ground, the Dutch people poured into the streets to greet them. Children waved flags, women hugged soldiers, and villagers offered apples, bread, and even bottles of wine. Some paratroopers barely had time to unclip their chutes before they were mobbed by cheering civilians. One soldier recalled being handed a bouquet of flowers while still carrying his rifle, a surreal mix of war and celebration. For a brief moment, it felt like the storybook version of liberation, a warm welcome, smiling faces, and grateful hearts. But war has a way of shattering illusions quickly. The bridges were the real prize, and the Germans knew it. They weren't about to let them go without a fight. Easy Company advanced through fields and towns, often cheered by Dutch civilians one minute and shot at by Germans the next. It was a strange, disorienting contrast. Soldiers joked that Holland was the only place where you could be given an apple by a child in the morning and then nearly killed by a sniper in the afternoon. Street fighting was vicious. Buildings turned into fortresses. Every window could hide a machine gun. Every cellar a nest of resistance. Paratroopers crept from house to house, rifles ready, grenades at hand. The sound of boots on cobblestones was often drowned out by the crack of gunfire. Smoke drifted through narrow streets, mingling with the smell of bread, still baking in untouched kitchens. Civilians huddled where they could, some whispering prayers, others simply watching as their towns became battlegrounds. The operation depended on speed, on seizing bridges before the Germans could regroup. But the further the Allies pushed, the more stretched their supply lines became. Fuel was scarce, ammunition dwindled, and reinforcements lagged behind. Tanks bogged down in narrow roads and muddy fields. Men went hungry, cold, and exhausted, all while facing fresh German units rushing to the fight. Easy Company held their ground as best they could, often outnumbered and outgunned. They set up defenses in villages, dug in along canals, and fought off attacks from every direction. One soldier described it as trying to hold back the tide with a bucket. Another said it felt less like an operation and more like a stubborn refusal to die. The bridges themselves became symbols of both hope and despair. Some were taken, but others, most importantly the bridge at Arnhem, were not. The plan, so bold on paper, unraveled in practice. The road to Germany remained closed. For the men on the ground, the failure was bitter. They had fought hard, suffered losses, and seen civilians suffer alongside them, only to retreat. Soldiers grumbled darkly about the grand plan that had left them hungry, tired, and stuck in battles they couldn't win. Humor, as always, softened the edge. One man quipped that Market Garden should have been called Market Mud, for all the time they spent crawling through soggy ditches. Another joked that the only thing they'd secured was a lifetime hatred of Dutch rain. Yet even in frustration, Easy Company had shown their grit. They held positions against odds that would have broken lesser units. They fought street by street, house by house, refusing to give in even when the bigger picture was crumbling. When orders finally came to pull back, they did so with heavy hearts but unbroken spirit. The Dutch civilians never forgot them. For all the failure of the operation, the people of Holland remembered the paratroopers who had fallen from the sky like angels, bringing hope, however briefly, to a land long under occupation. To this day, veterans of Easy Company would recall the gratitude of the Dutch people with something close to wonder. As autumn gave way to winter, Easy Company moved on. They had jumped into daylight and landed among cheers, only to find themselves once more in mud and blood. The promise of an easy road into Germany had vanished. What lay ahead was not a quick victory, but a long, bitter fight, and their hardest trial was still to come. Bastogne did not look like the kind of place where history was supposed to be made. A sleepy Belgian market town, framed by forests and farms, it was the kind of place where people bought bread in the morning, milked cows in the evening, and measured time by the ringing of church bells. In December 1944, those bells had long since gone silent. In their place came the thunder of artillery and the low drone of approaching aircraft. For the men of Easy Company, Bastogne became less a town on a map and more a crucible in which they would be tested like never before. The march to the Ardennes began suddenly in the middle of December, when the Germans launched their surprise counterattack. Easy Company had been resting in Mourmelon, France, after months of fighting. Rest was a relative term. It mostly meant warm food, clean uniforms, and a chance to patch up gear that had been falling apart since Normandy. Some of the men even dared to believe they might get a pass home for Christmas. That fantasy evaporated overnight. Trucks were loaded, orders shouted, and the company was on the move toward the snow-covered forests of Belgium. They were rushed, so rushed that most men left without proper winter clothing. Their boots were standard issue, leather, not lined, meant for mud, not blizzards. Their coats were thin, their gloves non-existent. Some grabbed blankets, others had none. As the trucks bounced down frozen roads, snow stinging their faces, men joked bitterly that the army seemed to think they were penguins. When they arrived near Bastogne, there was no time to settle. They were ordered straight into the woods, told to dig in and prepare for an enemy attack. The ground was frozen solid, shovels bent, picks barely scratched the surface, and men resorted to using bayonets, helmets, even their bare hands to carve out foxholes. It was exhausting work, done in the dark, with the distant rumble of artillery promising worse to come. Some holes were shallow, barely enough to lie down in. Others managed deeper pits, wide enough for two men to squeeze together for warmth. No matter how well dug, every hole was a coffin waiting to be tested. The cold was unrelenting. Breath came out in clouds that froze on scarves and collars. Sweat from digging turned to ice on skin. At night, the temperature plunged so low that rifles froze solid. Men learned to cradle their weapons like children, tucking them under coats to keep the metal from locking up. Boots froze too, hard as bricks, so that in the morning men had to beat them against the ground or piss on the leather to thaw them enough to wear. Socks stiffened like boards, the stench rising even through the numbness. Frostbite was a constant threat. Some toes blackened, others went numb for days. The fear of amputation hung over every man. And then came the shelling. The Germans pounded Bastogne day and night. Artillery shrieked overhead, exploding in the treetops. When shells hit branches, splinters rained down like jagged knives. Men called them tree bursts, and they were as feared as shrapnel. The sound was deafening. The concussions shaking snow from branches, rattling teeth in jaws. At first, every incoming round sent men diving to the bottoms of their foxholes. After days, the terror dulled. Soldiers learned to measure the danger by ear. If you heard the whistle pass overhead, you were safe. If the sound grew louder and then stopped, you weren't. The foxholes became the center of life. 2 men per hole, sometimes 3. They sat shoulder to shoulder, blankets wrapped tight, taking turns sleeping while the other kept watch. Conversations were muted, half-whispered through chattering teeth. They talked about home, about food, about what they'd do when the war ended. Sometimes they told dirty jokes. Sometimes they said nothing at all, staring blankly at the snow, as if trying to will themselves anywhere else. Food was scarce, supply lines were cut, and the men had little more than K rations. Small boxes containing dry biscuits, powdered drink, a cube of chocolate, maybe a tin of cheese spread. The biscuits were so hard they could chip teeth, and the cheese was more glue than food. Men melted snow to drink, chewed on frozen bread like jerky, and passed around whatever scraps they had. When supplies finally dropped from the sky, they tore into crates like starving animals. Spam, hard candy, cigarettes, even toilet paper. Luxuries beyond imagination. A man who got a can of peaches was king for a day. Cigarettes became currency. They were smoked down to the filter, then torn apart so the last bits of tobacco could be rolled into one final thin smoke. Sharing a cigarette was an act of friendship as real as taking a bullet for someone. Some men carried butts in tins, saved for when things got truly unbearable. The smoke was harsh, but it filled mouths with warmth, however fleeting. The wounded haunted the men as much as the cold. When shells landed close, screams cut through the forest. Comrades dragged the injured back to aid stations, but there was little comfort waiting there. Medics worked with frozen fingers. Bandages ran out. Morphine was scarce. Some bandages were used so many times they were stiff with blood. Men bit down on belts while wounds were stitched, tears freezing on their cheeks. The aid station smelled of iodine and despair, and yet the medics never stopped. One soldier later said the medics were the bravest of them all. Men without rifles, who crawled into the shelling to pull others back. Amid the misery, humor flickered like sparks. One morning, after a night of endless shelling, a soldier stuck his head above his hole and announced, "5-star resort. I'm leaving a review." Another replied, "Don't bother. No one's coming after us anyway." Laughter rippled through the line, short and sharp, a release of tension before the next barrage. Humor was survival. Without it, despair would have won. The German demand for surrender was almost comical. They sent word that the 101st Airborne should lay down arms and spare themselves further destruction. General McAuliffe's reply, "Nuts," reached the foxholes within hours. Men repeated it like a mantra. "Nuts," they shouted at incoming shells. "Nuts," they muttered when their boots froze to their feet. It was absurd, but so was their survival. Night in Bastogne was the worst. Darkness swallowed the forest. The snow glowed faintly under the moon, but shadows were thick, and every sound felt like a threat. Men lay awake, listening for German patrols, for the crunch of boots on snow. Sometimes flares lit the sky, casting everything in ghostly white. Other times the night passed in eerie silence, broken only by coughing, snoring, or the crack of distant rifle fire. Sleep, when it came, was shallow, haunted by dreams of warmth and food that dissolved at dawn. The battle dragged on for days that felt like years. Each morning, the men emerged from holes like ghosts, faces gaunt, eyes hollow. They checked rifles, stomped feet to restore circulation, and waited for the shelling to begin again. Each night, they crawled back into the earth, praying for one more sunrise. When the skies finally cleared and Allied planes roared overhead, the relief was overwhelming. Crates tumbled down, parachutes blossoming against the blue. Men sprinted into the snow, ignoring sniper fire, dragging supplies back like hunters returning with prey. Warm clothes, ammunition, medical supplies, salvation falling from the sky. Some men wept openly. Others tore into tins of meat, chewing greedily, grease freezing on their lips. It wasn't just supplies, it was hope. When Patton's Third Army finally reached Bastogne, tanks rumbling into the town, Easy Company had already written their legend. They had held the line against impossible odds. They had endured the cold, the hunger, the endless shelling, and they had not broken. They were gaunt, frost-bitten, filthy, and hollow-eyed, but they were still there. Bastogne became a word that meant more than geography. For the men who survived it, it was a scar they carried forever. For those who didn't, it was the place where their stories ended. And for history, it was proof that ordinary men could endure extraordinary hell, so long as they endured it together. For years, the Rhine River had been a line on maps, a looming barrier that symbolized the boundary between Germany and the rest of Europe. Soldiers had stared at it in briefings, heard officers talk about it in mess tents, and seen its winding blue line on hand-drawn charts. Crossing it was always described as the key to breaking into Germany proper, the last great obstacle before the heart of the Reich. By early 1945, Easy Company was on its way there. They were tired, bone-deep tired, after months of fighting through the Ardennes and the endless mud of Belgium and Luxembourg. Yet there was a strange energy in the air. They knew this was different. This was Germany. This was stepping into the enemy's home, where the war had begun, and they hoped where it might finally end. The march toward the Rhine took them through towns scarred by war. Villages, once neat and orderly, now lay shattered. Roofs blown off. Windows shattered. Churches gutted by fire. Civilians moved through the ruins with blank expressions, carrying bundles of belongings, or searching the rubble for anything worth saving. Some looked at the Americans with gratitude, others with suspicion, a few with outright hostility. The paratroopers had long since grown used to the mixed reception. Liberation was a word that didn't feel the same to everyone. As they approached the river, the tension grew. The Rhine was wide, swollen with winter melt, its dark waters fast and cold. On the far bank, the Germans had fortified their positions, ready to make any crossing a bloodbath. Easy Company and the rest of the 101st were ordered to prepare. Preparation meant briefings in barns and basements, officers tracing maps with gloved fingers, outlining objectives by lantern light. The men listened in silence, smoking or chewing on cold rations, nodding when required. Everyone understood what was coming, another gamble, another test of whether they could do the impossible. Crossing a river under fire is one of the most dangerous operations in war. Boats are heavy, awkward, and obvious targets. Men are exposed, paddling across open water while machine guns and mortars rain down. For Easy Company, it felt like another nightmare waiting to happen. The night of the crossing was cold and moonless. The men moved to the banks in silence, boots crunching on frosted ground, rifles slung across shoulders. The boats were simple affairs, canvas stretched over wooden frames, light enough to carry, but fragile enough to tear. They creaked as they were lowered into the water, the sound unnerving in the stillness. Men climbed in carefully, balancing their gear, gripping paddles. Some whispered curses, others muttered prayers. The river smelled of mud and decay, its black surface reflecting faint starlight. Orders were given in hushed tones. Then with a push, the boat slipped from the bank and into the current. The water was icy, the kind of cold that burned through gloves and froze fingers stiff. Paddles splashed softly, the only sound besides breathing. Every man strained to be silent, to keep the rhythm steady, knowing that one wrong move could send the boat spinning or flipping. The current pulled hard, dragging at the canvas, threatening to sweep them downstream. And then came the fire. German machine guns opened from the far bank, tracers stitching the night, bullets snapping across the water, mortars thumped, shells crashing into the river with towering plumes, men bent low, paddling desperately, water spraying into faces. Some boats were hit, ripped apart, spilling men into the freezing river. The black water swallowed them, gear dragging them down before they could cut free. Shouts echoed, then vanished, but still they pushed forward. Easy Company made landfall on the German side, boots sinking into mud, rifles already raised. They scrambled up the banks, hearts pounding, bodies numb from cold, and pressed into the darkness. Firefights flared almost immediately, Germans firing from dugouts, from buildings near the shore, from positions prepared for just this moment. The fighting was close and brutal. Men fired blindly into shadows. Grenades exploded in bursts of light, shouts and screams mixing with the roar of gunfire. The smell of gunpowder and river mud filled the air. Every step was contested. Every building a potential death trap. But Easy Company advanced with the stubborn determination that had carried them from Normandy to Bastogne. By dawn, positions were secured. The far bank of the Rhine was in American hands. Men who had crossed looked back at the river, its waters flowing cold and dark, littered with wreckage. Some boats had never made it. Some friends were gone, their absence marked only by empty spaces in the ranks. But the line had been crossed. The unthinkable had been done. For the soldiers, the crossing felt like more than just another battle. It was symbolic. The Rhine was Germany's pride, its natural defense. To stand on the far bank was to say, we are here in your heartland, and we are not leaving. It was proof that the war was entering its final act. Life after the crossing was no easier. The advance into Germany meant more towns, more skirmishes, more long marches through mud and ruin. But there was a shift. The Germans were retreating now, surrendering in larger numbers. Resistance was fierce in pockets, but increasingly desperate. Easy Company moved forward with a grim sense that the end was finally within reach. At night, sitting in captured houses or dugouts, men talked about what crossing the Rhine meant. Some compared it to Currahee, another climb, another impossible task. They had survived. Others simply said nothing, staring at the fire, lost in thoughts of the friends who hadn't made it across. One soldier joked, "I always wanted a river view, just didn't think it'd involve being shot at." The laughter was thin, but it was laughter all the same. For historians, the Rhine crossing was a strategic victory. For Easy Company, it was another scar, another memory etched into their bones. The sight of black water under tracer fire, the feel of paddles slipping in frozen hands, the sound of boats tearing apart under machine gun bursts. Those were the details that stayed with them. Crossing the Rhine didn't end the war, but it broke something in the German defense. The path into the heart of the Reich was open. Easy Company had taken one more impossible step, and in doing so, carried themselves closer to the end. But as always, the cost was counted not in maps or speeches, but in empty bunks and names never called again at roll. When Easy Company crossed into Germany, they thought they had seen everything war could throw at them. They'd seen men cut down in fields, bodies shattered by artillery, comrades frozen stiff in foxholes. They had fought in streets littered with broken glass, marched through villages reduced to rubble, and carried wounded brothers out of forests that felt like tombs. By 1945, they believed they were hardened, immune to shock. And then they found the camps. The first signs were faint. A strange smell carried on the wind, different from the smoke and rot they knew so well. It was heavier, sour, like sickness baked into the air. The closer they marched, the stronger it grew, until even men who had chewed through the stench of battle felt their stomachs turn. Some gagged. Others covered their mouths with scarves. None of them had words for it. The gates were ordinary enough. Barbed wire, wooden posts, guard towers. Easy Company approached cautiously, rifles ready, expecting another fortified position, another fight. But what they found inside was not soldiers. It was prisoners. They were shadows of people, starving, skeletal, their faces hollowed by hunger, their eyes enormous in skull-like faces. Their striped uniforms hung off them like rags, the cloth stiff with dirt and sweat. Some stumbled toward the Americans with arms outstretched, whispering words in languages the paratroopers didn't understand. Others simply sat where they were, too weak to rise, staring blankly as if unable to believe rescue had come. The smell made sense now. It was death, not fresh, but old and lingering. Piles of corpses lay stacked like firewood, limbs tangled, skin gray and stretched tight. The living moved among the dead as if numb to it, as if the difference between life and death had become too thin to notice. The men of Easy Company, who had faced machine guns without flinching, broke. Some wept openly, tears freezing on their cheeks. Others turned away, vomiting into the dirt. A few stood frozen, rifles limp at their sides, unable to move. One soldier later said, "We thought we had seen hell." Then we opened the gates. They gave what they could. Rations were torn open, chocolate bars broken into pieces, canteens passed hand to hand. Prisoners devoured the food with desperate urgency, but some collapsed after the first bite. Their bodies, so starved, couldn't handle sudden nourishment. The sight was unbearable, men dying with chocolate still melting on their tongues. The paratroopers, who had spent months cursing their own meager rations, suddenly felt the cruel luxury of having had enough. Medics did what they could, but there was no real preparation for this. Blankets were spread, fires lit, attempts made to organize the chaos. Some soldiers took prisoners' hands and sat with them, offering what little comfort they could. Words didn't matter. The simple presence of another human being, clean and strong and alive, was enough. For the first time, Easy Company understood what they had been fighting against. Battles, towns, bridges, those had all been pieces on a chessboard. Here was the reason. Here was the true face of the regime they had come to destroy. The camps stripped away any illusions. This was not just war. This was systematic cruelty, industrialized suffering. The prisoners clung to their liberators. Some kissed their hands. Others whispered, "Danke," or "Merci." A few simply stared in disbelief, as if afraid the Americans were a mirage that might vanish. Easy Company, hardened killers, felt awkward in the embrace of men too frail to stand. One soldier admitted later that he felt guilty that he could walk, eat, breathe, while others had been reduced to shadows. Not all prisoners lived to see freedom. Despite the paratroopers' best efforts, many died in the days that followed. Their bodies, too broken by hunger and disease, simply gave out. Soldiers who had carried men out of burning buildings and dragged comrades off battlefields now found themselves powerless, watching lives slip away in their arms. It was a different kind of helplessness, and in some ways it cut deeper. The memory of the camps never left them. Some men spoke of it often, unable to contain the horror. Others never spoke of it again, burying the images so deep that even their families never heard the details. But in their silences, the weight was clear. One veteran later said, "I forgot the battles. I forgot the dates, but I never forgot the faces." That night, sitting by their fires, the men of Easy Company were quieter than usual. Cigarettes were smoked in silence, rations eaten mechanically. A few stared into the flames, eyes distant. One man muttered, "Now I know why we're here." Another nodded but said nothing, pulling his blanket tighter. For once, there were no jokes, no gallows humor. Some horrors left no room for laughter. The liberation of the camps changed them. They had survived Bastogne, crossed the Rhine, marched through fire and snow. But here, amid barbed wire and corpses, they felt the full gravity of their war. They weren't just fighting for ground. They were fighting against something far darker. And in that moment, they understood the true cost of what they were doing and what would have happened if they had failed. In later years, when Easy Company veterans gathered and swapped stories, Bastogne would always come up. Normandy, Carentan, Holland, those too. But when the camps were mentioned, voices dropped. Jokes died on lips. Men who had been loud and boisterous fell silent, staring at the floor, because some memories were too heavy to share lightly. The war had made them brothers. The camps reminded them why. The road to Berchtesgaden wound upward into the Bavarian Alps, twisting through valleys and villages that looked like postcards untouched by war. After months of ruined towns and blasted forests, the scenery was almost too beautiful to believe. Green fields stretched under clear skies, rivers ran cold and bright, and wooden chalets sat neatly against the slopes. For Easy Company, weary and hollow from years of battle, it was like walking into another world. But this world wasn't just any German town. Berchtesgaden was infamous. High above, perched on a rocky peak, stood Hitler's retreat, the Eagle's Nest. To the Allies, it had become a symbol, part myth and part reality, of the Nazi elite. Rumors painted it as a fortress in the clouds, filled with treasures looted from across Europe, stocked with wines, cigars, and luxuries unimaginable to men who had lived on Spam and snow. Some whispered that Hitler himself had hidden there. Others believed it was the final redoubt, where fanatics would fight to the death. Easy Company marched with curiosity as much as caution. The approach to the town was tense at first. The war wasn't quite over. German soldiers still lingered in the hills, some ready to fight, others eager to surrender. But as the paratroopers entered Berchtesgaden, the reality was anticlimactic. White flags hung from windows. Civilians peeked from behind curtains. Resistance, if it had ever been planned, melted away. The town, untouched by the devastation that scarred so much of Europe, was theirs, without a shot fired. And then came the mountain. The road to the Eagle's Nest spiraled upward, narrow and precarious, flanked by cliffs and forests. Trucks groaned under the weight of men and gear, climbing steadily toward the clouds. When the vehicles could go no further, the paratroopers marched the last stretch on foot, boots crunching against gravel, lungs burning in the thin air. The higher they went, the more surreal it became. This was not the battlefield they knew. This was a resort, a retreat built with obscene wealth, designed to impress visiting dignitaries with its scale and splendor. At the top, they found the Eagle's Nest itself. The building stood like a jewel against the mountain, its stone walls solid, its design elegant. It was not a bunker, but a palace in miniature, perched as if on the roof of the world. Walking inside, the men of Easy Company stepped into a different reality. Marble floors gleamed underfoot. Fireplaces stood tall, their mantels carved with care. The furniture was fine, upholstered in rich fabrics. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, their crystals catching the light. And beneath it all, in storerooms and cellars, were treasures. Crates of wine and champagne, cigars in neat boxes, shelves of delicacies most of the soldiers hadn't seen since childhood. For men who had frozen in foxholes at Bastogne, the contrast was dizzying. They tore into the wine cellars, popping corks, drinking champagne from crystal glasses. Cigars were lit, their smoke curling into the rafters. Some lounged in armchairs meant for Nazi officials, boots propped on polished tables, laughing at the absurdity of it. A few posed for photographs, mugs of wine in hand, grins wide. There was looting, of course. Souvenirs were pocketed. Pistols, daggers, flags, silverware. One man claimed a pair of binoculars. Another stuffed a Nazi banner into his pack. A few smuggled bottles of brandy back down the mountain. For soldiers who had risked their lives for years, it felt like a small deserved indulgence. But amid the celebration, there was unease. Some men wandered the halls in silence, taking it all in, the marble, the luxury, the excess, all of it built while Europe burned. One paratrooper muttered, "This is what they had while our friends froze in foxholes." Another shook his head, staring at a dining table set for a banquet, and said nothing. The eagle's nest became less a trophy and more a symbol of the obscene gap between the men who had started the war and the men who had fought it. Easy Company, dirty, ragged, and scarred, sat in Hitler's retreat with champagne glasses in hand, knowing how far they had come, from Currahee to Normandy, from Holland to Bastogne. They had trudged through mud and blood, and now here they were, in marble halls built for tyrants. The irony was not lost on them. Outside, the view was staggering. The Alps stretched in every direction, peaks capped with snow, valleys rolling below. Men stood on the terraces, cigars in hand, staring at the horizon. Some laughed, some posed for pictures, but others simply gazed in silence. One said quietly, "Looks like heaven. Shame we had to go through hell to get here." The celebration did not erase the losses. Empty bunks back in camp, names uncalled at roll, shadows that lingered in every memory. Drinking champagne didn't bring back friends who had fallen in Normandy, in Carentan, in Holland, in the frozen woods of Bastogne. The luxury was hollow, a strange coda to years of misery. And yet, the eagle's nest mattered. It was proof, tangible and undeniable, that the men of Easy Company had made it to the end. They had marched into the very heart of Nazi power, not as prisoners or victims, but as victors. They had climbed higher than they ever expected, and in doing so, they had carried the memory of their brothers with them. For some, the eagle's nest was a party, a chance to drink, smoke, and laugh in triumph. For others, it was a reminder of what they had endured and what they had lost. For all, it was a moment they would never forget. When the war finally ended, when Germany surrendered and silence settled over Europe, the eagle's nest remained in memory as the strangest of prizes. Not a battlefield, not a victory won by blood, but a surreal mountaintop where the war's survivors paused, drank, and wondered at the absurdity of it all. Years later, veterans of Easy Company would speak of it with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. They would tell stories of cigars and champagne, of souvenirs stuffed into packs, of mountain views and marble halls. But always, beneath the laughter, there was a note of sorrow. Because the eagle's nest, for all its splendor, could never erase the foxholes, the hunger, the frozen nights, or the empty spaces at reunions. The eagle's nest was a chapter in their story, a strange, glittering pause between the horrors of war and the long road home. A place where they stood at the top of the world and realized that even victory could feel heavy. The war did not end with a bang for Easy Company. It ended with a whisper. By the spring of 1945, everyone could feel it coming. The German army was collapsing, retreating on every front, its soldiers surrendering in droves. What had once been fierce resistance turned into half-hearted skirmishes, then into white flags raised from windows, rifles abandoned in ditches. Rumors ran ahead of the truth. Hitler was dead, Berlin had fallen, the war was over, each whisper carrying more hope than certainty. The men of Easy Company moved forward cautiously, rifles still ready, but in their hearts they knew the end was close. When the official word finally came, it felt unreal. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was finished. The reactions were as varied as the men themselves. Some cheered, loud and unrestrained, shouting and laughing until their voices cracked. They hugged each other, slapped backs, and grinned with the giddy relief of men who had survived the unsurvivable. Others wept quietly, heads bowed, tears sliding down faces that had seen too much. A few simply sat in silence, staring into the distance, too stunned to react at all. For those who had lived from Currahee to the Eagle's Nest, the news was less triumph than release. They had been wound tight for so long, braced for the next order, the next battle, the next loss. Now, suddenly, there was nothing. No more jumps into darkness, no more frozen foxholes, no more death lurking in every shadow. Just silence. But silence was not simple. It left space for memories to rush in, faces of friends who hadn't made it home, names unspoken at roll call, jokes that would never be told again, cigarettes that would never be shared. Victory felt heavy with absence. One soldier said later, "We won, but I didn't feel like celebrating." Too many of us weren't there to see it. In the days that followed, Easy Company settled into an odd limbo. They were still soldiers, still in uniform, still answering to officers, but there were no more battles to fight. Their days were filled with routine, guard duty, patrols, paperwork, cleaning weapons that might never be fired again. The urgency was gone, replaced by a strange emptiness. Some men celebrated the only way they knew how, drinking, smoking, and laughing too loudly. Others avoided celebration altogether, unable to reconcile joy with the memories of what they had seen. A few found quiet corners and wrote letters home, trying to put into words what could never really be explained. "I'm safe now," some wrote. "It's over." But even as they wrote the words, they wondered what safe really meant after everything. The civilians of Germany looked on warily. For years, they had been taught to see men like Easy Company as monsters. Now defeated, they watched them with a mixture of fear, resentment, and relief. The paratroopers, for their part, kept their distance. Some shared food with children, others ignored the civilians entirely. Trust was not something that grew overnight. The end of the war brought choices. Some men had enough points to go home immediately, their service long and bloody enough to guarantee it. Others would stay behind, part of the occupation force, keeping order in a country that had just collapsed. The thought of going home filled them with both joy and dread. Home meant family, safety, normalcy, but it also meant leaving behind the only brothers who truly understood. In those final weeks in Europe, Easy Company leaned on each other more than ever. They played cards, swapped stories, teased each other about old mistakes. They told the same jokes over and over because repetition was comfort. They ate when they could, drank when they could, and filled the hours with small rituals that kept the silence at bay. But always the memories pressed in. Bastogne, Carentan, Holland, the Rhine, the camps. Each man carried his own ghosts, and while they shared some of them, others stayed locked away, too painful to voice. When the time came to go home, the farewells were awkward. These were men who had lived side by side in mud and blood, who had shared foxholes and marched into fire together. How do you say goodbye to that? Some shook hands, others hugged quickly, embarrassed by the emotion. A few simply said, "See you," as if they would meet again next week, though they knew they might never cross paths again. Ships carried them back across the Atlantic, the same ocean they had crossed years before as young recruits. The journey home was quieter, more somber. Men stood on deck, staring at the waves, thinking of what waited for them, wives, parents, children, jobs, and of what they were leaving behind. America welcomed them as heroes, but many felt out of place. The world they had left behind seemed smaller now, trivial compared to what they had endured. Some found work easily, others struggled. Some built families, others drifted. The war lived in all of them, in scars visible and invisible. Nightmares woke them, sudden noises startled them, quiet moments brought back faces long gone. And yet they carried on. because that's what Easy Company did. They endured. Years later, when they gathered for reunions, they picked up where they had left off. White-haired now, bellies softer, voices weaker, but when they sat together, they were the same young men again. They told the same stories about Currahee, about Sobel's endless drills, about the jump into Normandy, about the cold of Bastogne, about the champagne at the Eagle's Nest. They laughed, they cried, and they remembered. Always they remembered. The war had ended in May 1945, but for Easy Company, it never truly ended. It lived in their memories, in their friendships, in the bond that outlasted uniforms and battlefields. When asked what made them heroes, many shrugged. They hadn't felt like heroes. They had felt like scared young men doing what had to be done. One step, one battle, one frozen night at a time. The medals, the books, the television series, those came later. At the time, all they had was each other. And that was enough. Because in the end, that was the story of Easy Company. Not the battles, not the victories, not even the war itself, but the brotherhood. Ordinary men, bound together in extraordinary times, who walked through hell side by side and made it out the other end.